me discussing mTOR and mentioning diet, at least in the introduction, it allows me to introduce a character into the story that you've heard me discuss before. And indeed, it has been difficult for me not to mention it yet. After all, few things influence mTOR more than the humble hormone, or what I said earlier, the petite peptide, insulin. Insulin plays a central role in regulating autophagy because it plays a central role in signaling a nutrient level. And in particular, when insulin goes up, the body transitions into what I like to refer to, by quoting other famous physiologists, the fed state. And the fed state is a state of storage and growth. That is anabolic. So insulin is one of the most powerful activators of anabolic or building processes. When insulin levels rise, such as after a carbohydrate-rich meal, so eating refined starches and sugars, that is going to spike insulin considerably. And that alone is not a bad thing, but as it happens too much, it becomes problematic. But suffice it to say, this signals to the body, to the cells, that nutrients are plentiful and that it's time to grow. It's time to build molecules or become anabolic. This, of course, relies on protein mediators like mTOR. But mTOR is anathema to autophagy because autophagy, insulin and mTOR wants anabolism to predominate, while autophagy is the ultimate catabolic process. So in this context, insulin encourages the cell to focus on anabolic processes like protein synthesis or glycogen storage or lipid synthesis, but namely or collectively prioritizing growth and repair over the catabolic breakdown of these molecules and recycling of organelles. Now, these opposing forces, anabolism promoted by insulin and catabolism mediated through autophagy, highlight the balance that the cell has to maintain to function optimally. When insulin levels are persistently elevated, like you have as both cause and consequence of insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes, autophagy could remain chronically suppressed. You don't want that off all the time. This can lead to the accumulation of the damaged organelles and proteins and ultimately contribute to cellular dysfunction. We want to balance insulin levels. So if insulin gets spiked, it's up and then it's down. We need to have this balance of periodic activation of autophagy or catabolic processes, allowing the cell to clean itself, but we balance that with necessary anabolic activities. Okay, now talking about insulin prompts me to transition into low carbohydrate diets or ketogenic diets, and then how they influence autophagy, because there is growing evidence on this that's pretty compelling that I think you'll find interesting. Of course, if a diet is ketogenic, that means by necessity it is a diet that has lowered insulin. Insulin is a powerful inhibitor of ketogenesis. So if a body is ketogenic, making its own ketones, then insulin must be low. And for insulin to be low, you're either fasting a lot or you are restricting carbohydrates. So a low carbohydrate diet is generally, if carbs go low enough, going to be the ketogenic diet. Now, studies do indicate that ketogenic diets can enhance autophagic activity in certain tissues, including the brain, which can explain some of the benefit that people see with neurological disorders while adhering to a ketogenic diet. In fact, for instance, research has demonstrated that the treatment with a ketogenic diet does, in fact, increase the number of autophagic structures. So this evidence, the cellular evidence of autophagy being turned on in the hippocampus and the cerebral cortex in rodent models. So that very, very strong, very convincing evidence that a ketogenic diet is, in fact, promoting autophagy in the central nervous system, which, of course, is going to be very helpful with a handful of neurological disorders. Even further, I earlier mentioned kind of bad proteins or misfolded proteins. Misfolded proteins are a feature of cells, just normal cell biology, but as they accumulate, they can activate processes like inflammation through another process called ER, or endoplasmic reticulum stress. You can look that up to learn more, ER stress and inflammation. But also certain neurodegenerative disorders, like even Parkinson's, have been are believed to be influenced by misfolded proteins. Interestingly, beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the primary ketone in the body, can support health by addressing this. So, firstly, BHB directly enhances autophagy, a process, of course, this overall process of breaking down things, including misfolded proteins. So, BHB is a direct activator of this autophagy pathway. As a result, no surprise that as BHB goes up, misfolded protein content within the cell goes down. One of the ways also this happens, separately from just activating the autophagy pathways, is that BHB can change the solubility of the misfolded proteins, which helps them actually get into the lysosome in the first place to undergo autophagy. So this is a sort of dual benefit here. Activating the autophagy pathways and then directly enhancing the degree to which misfolded proteins get engulfed by the lysosome to undergo that autophagy. So ultimately, with regards to the ketogenic diet, and to wrap up that particular bit or that particular principle, there are two factors to be aware of when it comes to the ketogenic diet and autophagy. The first, as I mentioned when starting this little bit here, is that if a diet is ketogenic, it is necessarily one that keeps insulin low. When insulin is low, mTOR activation is low, and thus autophagy activity is high. That's a good thing when it comes to just generally wanting autophagy. But also, as mentioned, ketones have a direct effect as well, activating autophagy and, in the case of misfolded proteins, enhancing their kind of targeting by the lysosome. Now, one final note on all of this before I wrap up. You don't want autophagy all the time. Healthy cell biology and, by extension, physiology requires periods of both building up and breaking down. You have to have a balance of the anabolic and the catabolic. Too much catabolic, the body just starts to waste away. All tissue starts to decline. This is one reason why I'm so opposed to the drug activators of autophagy like rapamycin. In that earlier Metabolic Classroom I did, one of the studies I shared with you by Drummond et al. Was a human study that found that those humans on rapamycin had reduced muscle protein synthesis following workouts. It's directly challenging the muscle's ability to recover and build to be bigger and stronger following a workout. That is not a good trade-off. Now, what about a ketogenic diet? Some may think. Because that is a state of low insulin, is it too catabolic? Well, thankfully, the evidence suggests no. That one important thing is that as much as a ketogenic diet is going to be a diet that is generally keeping insulin low, you may think, well, then I'm not going to have any anabolic activation. You know, when I want my muscle to grow and I want mTOR turned on and autophagy turned off, how can I do that in the absence of too little insulin? First of all, there are other hormones that activate that, like IGF-1. That's the insulin-like growth factor, also known as the somatomedin or somatomedins. There are several. And those are produced when growth hormone goes up. Well, guess what happens on a low-carb or ketogenic diet? Growth hormone and IGF-1 can go up. But at the same time, generally when someone's adhering to a low-carb diet, they're eating an abundance of protein. And when you eat protein, that converts into amino acids. And guess what does similar effects to insulin in this case, namely activating mTOR and inhibiting autophagy, allowing for tissue growth? Amino acids. So amino acids become a bit of a redundant mechanism here that allows a person on a low-carb diet who may be worried about their low insulin when it comes to chronic activation of autophagy, but they need not. Amino acids play that role. They play the part that insulin might have in this particular context.